Hey there, this is Mark. In this video, we'll take a look at how to do reflections in these puddles. So reflections are basically reversing your character and then treating it a certain way. What we're going to do now is we're actually going to take a peg transform. We'll go down to the move category and take another peg transform out. And we'll wire this character down. We know it's already treated and we want it to reflect the exact same way. And let's put that in front, and let's just take a look here. We have our background, we have our puddles, and we have our shadow. Well, the reflection would happen after the puddle, before the shadow, because it would be underneath all that. So let's just wire it over here. And let's go to OpenGL so I don't preview every time. And then we'll add a peg to the transformation. So we've effectively got our girl going up here, and then a second instance going behind. Now we're going to go to my peg and I'll reverse the y-axis, which will flip her upside down. But I don't want to just do a -1 because that literally makes it a long shadow, or a long rather reflection. We want to shorten that, so I'll make it a -0.5 to kind of squish that down. And I can close this over here. Let's go to our timeline and scrub through a bit. This could be a good pose to stop on. Now, there's a couple of ways you can do this. You can simply move this down this way, and that can work. In this case, she's literally walking horizontally, so I don't have to worry about tracking. But if the character were working 3/4 walks or something like that, then you'd have to manually animate that tracking with the character. So the insertion point here allows you to track with the character if you're grabbing from the master peg of the character. So let's undo this first. And I'm actually going to go inside the girl folder. And up here you can see there's the girl master peg. So I want that information to plug into my insertion point. So I'll take another strand and I'll wire this outside. So we plugged it into our multi-port out, and now we can go outside and plug this into our insertion point. So this drops down, and it basically means that if this character were to move around, our peg would automatically track with it perfectly. And now I can use this peg and wire this down to match about here. Alright, so next I want to group all this because I like to have things neat and tidy, and this is going to start to get a little messy. So let's just Control G on a PC while holding the peg and the peg transform, or Command G on a Mac. And let's rename this Reflections. Okay. So now if we go inside, by default, as I said in previous tutorials, Harmony likes to make sure that everything is connected, so it created an export we don't need, so we'll reverse that. And now that we've got that, we also want to make sure that the reflection kind of fades away as it tapers off. We don't want it to be as vivid here. So I'm going to then take a cutter. Let's go down to our favorites and grab a cutter. And then I'm going to create a new shape so that it fades away here. So add a new drawing with Control R or Command R on a Mac. And let's call this Fader. And we're going to wire that in, and we want that fade to not just be a shape but blurred as well. So let's add that blur radial. And again, we can remove the truck factor, and let's make this 60 and see how that looks once we've got it. So we're going to choose our rectangle tool. Again, you want to make sure you have a color selected. I prefer to create a comp and have a palette from my comp library. And in the bottom of your rectangle tool properties, if you have this selected, it will fill it automatically. So I'll just zoom out here and I will draw a shape to fade away the reflection. Let's go back to our drawing and use the select tool to select the outside line and delete it so we have a single shape. And back in your timeline, we're going to make sure the fade drawing is selected and zoom to it in our timeline by hitting O. We have a single drawing. We want to make sure it lasts the entire time. So move that to the back and extend the exposure. Okay, so let's take a look and see what that current reflection looks like now. Hit render. So we can see that we have the character, it's fading away, it's not going inside our puddles, but this gives me an idea of how much fade we have. So 60 might be a little strong. Let's reduce that to 30. And that feels a little more right. So obviously we want the reflection to only happen when it's inside the puddles. So what do we do here? We go to our favorites and we're going to drag in a cutter. And we're going to make sure it's inverted because we want to say wherever these puddles show up, that's where this reflection can show up. Double click the little icon to reverse it, or make sure that it's checked as inverted in the layer properties. Next, we're going to connect it down here, and I'm going to wire this outside up here so that I can then get the information from the puddle drawing. So you see I've created a new input, and I'll grab that puddle and drag it down here. Great. So now you see our reflection is cut to the puddles specifically, which then allows us to only see the reflection when it's inside the puddles. There's only one problem here, is that it looks a little sharp, and we might actually just want to use a new technique for this. So let's go inside the reflection. And I like to use this technique to kind of feather away the edges of a shape. So think about this. If we have our shape going in and it's invert cutted, which means that it's going to show wherever we decide it's going to show, and we make it invert cutted by itself, which means that we're using the shape and saying you're only going to show where this shape is. But then we add a blur to the main shape. Let's make that chuck factored off and 10. So we're blurring the main puddle shape, and then we're making sure it only shows up within itself. And that's going to be the shape that we use to fade it away. And what that does is it just takes the edge off of the puddle shape, so it's a little less sharp. To understand this, I will switch to OpenGL momentarily, and I'll add a display. Let's look at the blurred shape first, and we can see that in OpenGL. So I've essentially taken the puddle shape, I've blurred it, and I said only show up where you are. And if we didn't have this blur, we'd see the entire thing, but because we're blurring it and it goes outside, once we cutter it to itself, then it gives this subtle feathered edge to it. And that's why our reflection can then show, but kind of bleeding at the edges here without going past. So this is a bit of a trick where, again, you blur the main shape, you make sure that it is cuttered to itself, and then that is what gets our reflection cuttered to it. Alright, so now we have our character and our basic reflection. Let's just delete that. Let's take another render look at this. And we have a couple of things we can do. First of all, when you're working in OpenGL, you might want to see this full reflection, and the fader shape here might get in your way. So what you might want to do is add a visibility node, and I'll just type that in here and plug that in. What the visibility node does is it allows you to choose whether it renders and shows up in OpenGL, or if you want to check one of these off. So if I say don't display in OpenGL but still render, that means that I want this operation to still happen, but visually in OpenGL I don't need to see it happening. So if I click this, essentially it's basically pretending like the fader drawing doesn't exist, it doesn't continue down here, and so we see the full extent of our reflection, but when we render it, the result is still the same because that fader shape is going through. You don't need this node, it's really just if you wanted to see this while working, as having it on kind of cuts away and you can't really see anything. Okay, and next what we want to do is make sure that this reflection looks pretty good. Now there's a couple of things we can do. First of all, we can kind of add a transparency module to that to fade it away. We don't want it to be a ice skating reflection. This doesn't look quite good. So let's go in here and add a transparency. Type in TRA, that'll bring up transparency, and I'll plug that in. Already this is starting to look better. Another thing I could do is I could make this a blend mode. So instead of using the actual normal shape, or rather the normal transform information, we can also just change it to an add mode or a screen mode, or in this case I'd like to use an overlay blend mode. So I'll look for the blending module and I'll plug this right here. Then I'll click the properties, and in the blend mode here I'll click down and go down to overlay right here. So you can see this makes a really nice reflection. Depending on your background or the type of reflection you need, you might choose overlay. You might also choose screen sometimes, but in this case it's way too bright, so I prefer to switch back to overlay. And I like to type in the name in here of the blend mode that I use so that I do know in the node view what it looks like. So I'll do that. Now I see the blend mode as such. And that's pretty good reflection. Now there's only one thing left to do for this reflection, and that's to make sure that the splashes also get reflected. If I scrub through here, you see the splashes don't have anything reflecting, which is inaccurate. So I'm going to simply create a new composite, Control H, or Command H on a Mac, and I'll plug that character in here. And now I'll make sure that I have the splash, let's see, right here, going in there. And now if we render that, we have our splash reflecting as well as our character. There's one more thing we can do here, and that's to change this to a matte reflection, to a single color in a puddle. When you're drawing reflections on ice, the actual character's reflection might be good. When you're drawing reflections on water, you might actually want a matte reflection, a single color reflecting under the water. So let's go inside our reflection again, and right in here I'm going to add a matte blur. Matte blur drops in, and if I simply render this, it won't look good because it goes to a white by default. So what I might want to do is I might want to eyedrop pick one of these blue colors and then go to a darker blue that I find is satisfying. Maybe there's too much saturation here. Maybe I want to make it a little darker. So there you go. Now you have a nice matted reflection that works much better for this scene since it's in water. And we have a nice reflection with our overlay blend mode and transparency to reflect both the character and the effect splashes.